I'm going to talk about a couple of projects today. One to do with suspension bridges, and the other to do with sand and synesthesia, all beginning with S. So first of all, I'm going to show you a film. Abrupt stop. So I really love working outside, and particularly in new cities and spaces where I'm a visitor. And what I love about it is I tend to look at the environment through a new lens. When I'm in this headspace, it's possible to look at a suspension bridge and see a giant, elaborate heart waiting to be plucked. I can look at a zebra crossing and see a piano, and even a gas holder and see a giant musical lung. So, to summarize my work, I create wearable sculptures. Some of these are wearable musical instruments, and they explore themes of connectivity and play. These musical instruments sometimes are embedded with digital technology, and so when they're clipped on the body and the wearer moves their body in an expressive way, they're then able to create their own soundscape. So the player of my wearable musical instruments is called a Movition, part mover, part instrument. Most of these instruments are wearable because I started off my career as a fashion designer, but they don't really look like clothes anymore. They look a little bit more like sculpture. A lot of the work that I produce is inspired by the city and the urban landscape, and especially bridges, which I love. So if the Movition were to wear one of my wearable musical instruments and move his or her body in an expressive way, they would then be able to trigger sound, and sometimes sound from the environment. All of this is kind of wrapped in a bubble of technology, or as I call it, poetic technology. So this is not something that's necessarily visible to the eye, but it's there to tell a story. The outcome of the work that I do is quite often seen through live laboratories, where I open my process up to the public, and so make things in a really rough and ready way with a team of people, and we get feedback from the public to try and sort of enhance our process. On top of this, I do a lot of interventions, so kind of guerrilla interventions in the street, testing new wearable instruments on the unsuspected public. I also do more traditional performances in the traditional sort of theatre or gallery. And finally, for the last few years, I've been making a lot of films, as it's a really wonderful way to show how these inventions work. So the first project that I'm going to talk about is the human heart. And what I love about this project is it takes me to these new places, meeting new people, where I can learn new things and learn about the world. And I really love that. I really love to go to a new place and be a novice and ask questions and be curious. And so it was very much in this headspace that a few years ago I sat on the Brooklyn Bridge and sat on its wooden walkway and listened to the sound and the clonking of footsteps as people walked along the wooden walkway. And it sounded very much like a kind of resonant xylophone to me. All of the sounds of people as they walked along, this kind of mixture of languages which became a human hum. The drone of traffic down below and the sound of the wind above. I wondered if all of these journey sounds were somehow traveling through the bridge. And I wondered if perhaps I could somehow create an instrument that would play the bridge. Was that possible? Could you play a bridge? And it was at this point that I realized that the bridge was in fact this giant, beautiful harp. And so I headed back to London, to my studio. And for about 3 years, I obsessively drew this kind of shadowy figure connected to bridges, and until it filled my studio walls. And then one day when I was researching, I discovered that the 130th anniversary of the Brooklyn Bridge was coming up. And I decided that this was my opportunity to try and make this mysterious instrument. I started off with this sketch. I wanted the instrument to be modular so that it could be attached to any kind of bridge, not just one bridge, and it could be sort of sustainable or used and perhaps used to play a different structure in the future. I worked with engineers from Queen Mary University of London, where we created the very first version of the harp. And here you can see all 3 versions, each one a little bit better than the last. The way that it works is it connects to the suspension cable or suspension rod and picks up the kind of vibrations through contact mics. These sounds are then manipulated using a retractable string that's embedded within the module, and by changing the angle and the length of the string, you're then able to play with the musical parameters of the bridge. Part of the process was collaboration, and I worked extensively with different universities to try and pool resources in order to be able to create the work. And so here are some examples of collaboration with Copenhagen Institute of Interaction Design, where I worked with students to develop exactly who this musician was, who was the bridge player, and what was the kit he or she may need to play the bridge. One of the important parts of this was the harness. The harness was the device that would connect you physically to the suspension bridge. And so for each different stop that we've been to visit, each different bridge, I've created a harness that's site-specific, catering for the needs of the bridge and the musician, and also inspired sometimes by the architecture. This one here was played on the Bob Kerrey suspension bridge in Omaha, which was a really beautiful sounding bridge. Sounded like Star Wars. Choo! It's really good. This is a harness that was worn on the Clifton Suspension Bridge. So it just recently turned 150 years old, so I made a film to celebrate that, and this is a clip. So one of the words that kept popping up for our process was bridge. It became a metaphor for our process. And by this kind of what became a global collaboration with different universities, lab spaces, and collaborators, I was able to achieve a lot more than I could have done on my own. And so this definitely changed the way that I was working, and all of a sudden, I was collaborating with all these different students who really added so much to the project. What I also discovered was it really started changing the way my brain was working. I was usually somebody who would be sat in my studio creating a sculpture one at a time, and all of a sudden my brain was having to become so much more elastic. But I felt it was quite difficult at times. I felt there was a kind of conflict between the right-hand side and the left-hand side of my brain, and I felt it was time for a change. I needed a break. I needed to move away from big things for a little while and look at the micro. So I decided that I wanted to create an intimate instrument. I wanted to give somebody the feeling of what it might be like to crawl through somebody's ear and tumble into their brain whilst they were listening to music. So opportunity came my way when I was awarded the artist residency for the European City of Science this year in Manchester. And I got to work with neuroscientists, bioscientists, and psychologists from the universities there to explore how our brains process sound. I was particularly taken with the phenomena of synesthesia and decided I wanted to develop a synesthetic musical instrument. I decided that I wanted the interface for this to be tactile and playful, and decided to start working with sand. I was curious to know, can you make music with sand? And can sand be a musical instrument? So the way that I started is the way that I usually do, by gathering collaborators, 2 Mancunian musicians, 2 gamers from up the road in Leeds, and a creative technologist. We all set up shop in the middle of Manchester and created a live laboratory where we tested our ideas and invited the public, all different people from different walks of life, to come in and give us feedback about our intimate musical instrument. So the first prototype looked a little bit like this. We started working with a Kinect to measure the height and the depth of the sand, and then also to observe where the person is who's playing with the sand. We also suspended a projector above the sand so that we could give the experience of synesthesia. So when you trigger a sound or you hear a sound, you might also see a color and a shape at the same time. So following this theme of synesthesia, I started to align the sounds that we were playing with different shapes and colors. And we decided to create 3 sandpits, each with its own kind of sonic personality. I thought it was really important that as you played and pushed your hands around in the sand, you got this feeling that this kind of visuals were trailing your movement. And so you had this kind of animation of particles that would follow your gesture. Here are the 3 sandpits that we created. We decided to call the project the Sensory Sound Pit, and we showed it at the Manchester Science Festival, which was just 10 days ago, and had over 3,000 people would come and visit. So that's where I'm up to, and I'll just give you a quick peep at what I'm hoping to do next. I was obviously quite excited about getting out in the fresh air after being in a darkened room for several days, and have decided to set up a kind of travelling lab. It's like a travelling R&D lab. The plan is to chuck a load of equipment in a van and go and visit different communities and find a way to play their distinctive, forgotten, iconic structures within the community, working with them, making films, all very, I want it to be quite fast, furious, lo-fi. I'm really interested in industrial structures, but also structures that are maybe earmarked for demolition and want to tell their story. My dream structure is the Lovell Telescope. It would be amazing to see if we could connect the heart to it to somehow play the cosmos. So if anybody wants to talk about that, I'm all ears. Thank you.